Howdy y'all, happy Monday. I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to do a study session with you. I already took an exam over this and I didn't pass it. I was maybe 5 or 6 questions from passing. So doing a little overview of the notes that I have, and I'm rereading this book that the test is based off of. This is mainly for me, some for you. You're along for the ride. But like I said, the exam is based off this book here. The test is for Microsoft Azure Administrator, and this book has 5 chapters, and I'm going to go through each chapter in a different video. I have study notes here, so we're going to go through the study notes for each chapter, and then the chapter summary. Alright, so the first chapter is Manage Azure Identities and Governance. Skill 1.1 is Manage Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Objects. Skill 1.2, Manage Role-Based Access Control, RBAC, and Skill 1.3, Manage Subscriptions and Governance. And then there's the chapter summary that the study notes goes over as well. So without further ado, here's the updated notes for the class. Skill 1.1, Manage Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Objects. Cloud-only users are created and managed exclusively in Azure AD, and their attributes can be updated directly in Azure AD. They can only be created through the Azure Portal, Azure PowerShell, and Azure CLI. Must be global administrator or user administrator to create new users. Only a username and the user's name, given name and surname, are mandatory when creating a new user. Group can contain groups, users, devices, or service principals. Security groups allow you to share Azure resource access to a group of users, devices, or service principals. Office 360 groups allow access to a shared mailbox, calendar, SharePoint site, and so on. Group membership types: assigned allows you to add and remove users manually. Dynamic user allows you to use dynamic group rules to automatically add or remove members. Dynamic device allows you to use dynamic group rules to automatically add and remove devices. Dynamic groups require an Azure AD Premium P1 license. You can change the membership type for a group after it has been created. Ways to manage devices: browsing to your Azure AD tenant and selecting devices through the devices blade for an individual user. To enable and disable devices, you must be a global administrator. Disabling a device prevents it from accessing Azure AD resources. This does not prevent the user from access resources in general. It only prevents the user from accessing resources from that disabled device. Must be global administrator to delete a device. Deleting a device prevents it from accessing your Azure AD resources and removes all details that are attached. Uploading users in bulk is a 3-step process. You download the CSV template, edit the CSV with bulk update values, and upload the CSV and submit the operation. Azure AD Join allows you to control devices, the application installed, and access from them, and how those applications interact with your corporate data. Associating devices with Azure AD gives you 3 options: registering a device, appropriate for personal devices; joining a device, useful for corporate-owned devices; hybrid AD joined, devices that are joined to your on-premises AD and are registered with your Azure AD tenant. Devices associated with Azure AD allows you to manage a device's identity like SSO and securing access using conditional access. Can be managed independently of the user's identity. Azure AD Join is an extension of device registration that changes the local state of the device. When a device is Azure AD joined, users can sign into the device using an organizational account instead of a personal account. Registration of devices in Azure AD can be combined with MDM solutions. Non-hybrid Azure AD Join is used for Windows 10 Pro and Windows 10 Enterprise. Hybrid Azure AD Join can use Windows 10, Windows 2016, Windows 7, 8.1, 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, and 2012 R2. SSPR license requirement: password change, cloud user only, included in all editions of Azure AD. Password reset, cloud user only. Microsoft 365 Business Standard, Microsoft 365 Business Premium, Azure AD Premium P1, Azure AD Premium P2. Password change, unlock, reset. Hybrid users, Microsoft 365 Business Premium, Azure AD Premium 1, Azure AD Premium 2. Azure AD requires 2 authentication methods by default for SSPR admins. Categories of Azure AD roles are Azure AD specific roles. These roles grant permissions to manage resources within Azure AD only. Service specific roles for major Microsoft 365 services, non-Azure AD. Cross-service roles, roles that span services, global administrator and global reader. All 365 services honor these roles. Azure AD license features. Azure AD free, user and group management, on-premises directory synchronization, basic reports, self-service password change for cloud users, and SSO across Azure, Microsoft 365, and many popular software as a service. Azure AD Premium P1 lets hybrid users access both on-premises and cloud resources. Also supports advanced administration such as dynamic groups, self-service group management, Microsoft Identity Manager, and cloud write-back capabilities, which allows self-service password to reset for your on-premises users. Azure AD Premium P2 offers Azure Active Directory identity protection to help provide risk-based conditional access to your apps and critical company data, and privilege identity management to help discover, restrict, and monitor administrators and their access to resources, and to provide just-in-time access when needed. Built-in roles are used to delegate permissions to perform administrative tasks within Azure AD administrative units. Azure CLI can be used to create and update Azure AD groups. Email addresses should be specific for each new guest account. Skill 1.2, Manage Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC. RBAC allows you to manage the entities called security principals that have access to Azure resources and the actions that those entities can perform. RBAC access can be granted to users, groups, service principals, and managed identities through role assignments. Azure RBAC is applicable to the management of resources created in Azure Resource Manager, ARM, deployment model. A role is the definition of what actions are allowed and or denied. RBAC is configured by selecting a role and associated the role with the security principal, such as a user, group, or service principal. Most privileged access right takes precedence when you have overlapping assignments. Role definition contains a list of permissions or declared permissions, and those permissions define what actions can or cannot be performed against a type of resource, such as read, write, or delete. RBAC roles are used to manage access and allow or restrict users to Azure resources, while Azure AD administrator roles are used to allow or restrict admins to perform identity tasks, such as creating new users, resetting passwords, and management groups are not applicable in all scenarios, and in some cases, a subscription will be the highest scope you will work with when applying role assignments. Security principals do not have access to Azure resources until a role assignment is made. Role assignments can be created and removed by people with the owner or user access administrator built-in roles. Azure blueprints and resource logs can be used to make deny assignments at a child scope. Limit of 5,000 custom roles per directory. Limit of 2,000 role assignments per subscription. Custom roles can be created from existing built-in roles, starting from scratch, or with a JSON file to find the custom permissions. Must have write permissions on all the items in a scope to create a custom role. Deny assignments are set and controlled by applying a resource lock for resources created through Azure blueprints. Built-in roles cannot be modified. A custom role definition is a collection of permissions that you add from a preset list. These permissions are the same permissions used in the built-in roles. Security principal, an identity that gets permissions. Role assignments can be created and listed in the portal Azure AD PowerShell or Microsoft Graph API. Custom roles can be created to provide a set of permissions that are not available when using built-in roles. Built-in roles can be cloned and then modified for small tweaks to permissions. Skill 1.3, Manage subscriptions and governance. A resource in Azure is a single service instance, which can be a virtual machine, a virtual network, a storage account, or any other Azure service. Resource groups are logical groupings of resource or their single service instance. Each resource in Azure can only exist in one resource group, and resource groups cannot be renamed. Azure Policy is an Azure service that can be used to create, assign, and manage policies that enforce governance in your Azure environment. Includes the application of rules that allow or deny a given resource type, apply tags automatically, and even enforce data sovereignty. Azure Policy provides a mechanism to express how the environment is governed for all users at a specific scope, regardless of RBAC assignments. Azure RBAC is a default deny mechanism with an implicit allow mechanism, whereas Policy is a default allow mechanism with an explicit deny system. Policy definition describes your desired behavior for Azure resources at the time resources are created or updated. Through a policy definition, you declare what resources and resource features are considered compliant within your Azure environment and what should happen when a resource is non-compliant. Azure policy scope types are management groups, subscription, and resource groups. When creating policy scopes, it is possible to configure excluded scopes, allows you to model your environment with rich declarations in the form of policy definitions that are applied exactly as required by your organization's governance needs. Azure resource locks, sometimes called management locks, are used to prevent the accidental deletion or modification of resources. The two lock types are cannot delete. Locks prevent the deletion of a resource. A cannot delete lock only prevents deletion of a resource and does not impede the modification of a resource. Read-only locks prevent users from modifying a resource, which includes updating or deleting a resource. Resource locks can be applied to a subscription, resource group, or resource scopes. Both read-only and cannot delete locks are inherited by child resources. Resource tags allows you to apply custom metadata to your Azure resources to logically organize them and to build out custom taxonomies. A tag is a name and value pair. Common tag types include the environment with which a resource is associated, a cost center, or a billing code, and a resource owner. Tags must be applied at the resource scope to be visible in detailed usage exports. Tags applied the resource group scope are not inherited by child resources. Azure Policy can be used to automatically apply tags to resources. Azure tag limitations are resource supports, not all resource support tags, number of tags. Resources, resource groups, and subscriptions are limited to 50 tags. Each resource can have different tags. Tag names. Tag names cannot exceed 512 characters. Storage account tag names are limited to 128 characters. Tag values cannot exceed 256 characters. Virtual machine tags. VMs cannot exceed 2048 characters for all tag names and values combined. Tag inheritance. Tags are not inherited by child resources. Tags applied to a resource group are not applied to resources in that resource group. Classic resources, only available for resources created in the Azure Resource Manager model. Illegal characters, tag names cannot contain these characters. Must have write access, attributor role, or higher access to apply tags to a subscription, resource group, or resource. Tags can be applied in both an imperative manner and declaratively through resource managed templates. Tags do not have inheritance, so if you need a tag to be applied to all resources in a resource group, then each resource must be tagged individually. Values used with the update az tag command replaces the specific tags in the listed resources. Merges the newly specific tags with the existing ones and overrides the conflicts for the listed resources. Deletes the specific tags from the listed resources. Factors when creating a resource group. A resource group cannot be nested in another resource group. You can add or remove a resource from a resource group at any time. You can move a resource from one resource group to another. A resource group can be used to scope access control. A resource group can be used to scope policy. A resource in a resource group can interact with the resources in another resource group. A resource group is created in a location. The location of a resource group specifies where the metadata for the resource group is stored. Microsoft recommends that all resources in a resource group share the same lifecycle. It is not mandatory to have all Azure resources belong to a resource group. Resources are deployed to a subscription, tenant, or management group. It is not mandatory to have all Azure resources belong to a resource group. Resources are deployed to a subscription, tenant, or management group exist outside of resource groups. While moving resources from one resource to another, the resources will be locked. and delete operations to the Azure resources will be blocked, but the underlying service will continue to function. Moving resources between subscriptions requires both subscriptions to be associated with the same Azure AD tenant. If the subscriptions do not belong to the same tenant, then you can update the target subscriptions to use the source Azure AD tenants by transferring ownership of the subscription to another account. A single move operation in the resource manager cannot move more than 800 resources. You can delete a resource group with the Azure portal, Azure PowerShell, the AZ CLI, or the REST API. Azure subscriptions have controls available that govern access to the resources within the subscription, govern costs through quotas and tagging, and govern the resources that are allowed in an environment with Azure policy. Classic subscription administrators have full access to an Azure subscription. They can manage resources through the Azure portal, Resource Manager's API, which includes the PowerShell and CLI. The account that is signed up for an Azure subscription is automatically set as both the account administrator and the service administrator. Access to the account center and creation of a new Azure subscription and billing changes only can be performed by the account administrator. There can only be one account administrator per account and one service administrator per subscription. Co-administrators have the same level of access as the service administrator but cannot change the association of subscriptions to Azure directories. Can be up to 200 co-administrators per subscription. Users with service administrator and co-administrator roles have the same access as a user who is assigned the Azure RBAC owner role at the subscription scope. Azure RBAC roles are owner, full access to all resources, delegate access to others. The service administrator and co-administrators are assigned the owner role at the subscription scope. It applies to all the resource types. Contributor, create and manage all types of Azure resources, cannot grant access to others, applies to all resource types. Reader, view Azure resources, applies to all resource types. User access administrator, manage user access to Azure resources. Management groups allow you to apply governance across subscriptions, including the applications of common RBAC controls and the application of Azure policy. Benefits of management groups: reduce overhead, enforcement, and reporting. RBAC applied at the management scope group level is inherited by all the child resources within the scope of the management group. Resource quotas are limits. Azure administrators can view the current consumption and uses of resources within an Azure subscription and understand how that consumption can be affected by Azure resource limits. You can also request quota increases for certain resource types. Spending quotas. Spending quotas allow administrators to set alerts within an Azure subscription by configuring budgets to inform the business when their Azure spending has hit a certain threshold, and a learning mechanism, and that does not stop resources from being created or consumed. Resource limits can stop resources from being created. Tags are crucial for tracking consumption logically and used to implement chargebacks within an Azure subscription. Submitting a request to increase a quota is only submitting a support request to Microsoft. Resource consumption within a subscription against a resource quota can be viewed with PowerShell. Budgets in Azure Cost Management provide Azure customer subscriptions under many offer types with the ability to proactively manage cost and monitor Azure spending and monitor Azure spent over a time at a subscription level. Budgets are a monitoring mechanism only with set thresholds and notification rules. Users must have at least read rights to a subscription to view budgets, and must have contributor or higher rights to create and manage budgets. Cost management contributor and cost management reader are two specialized roles that can be used to grant principals access to cost management data. Budgets can be created at the subscription, management group, or resource group scope if necessary. Action groups are a collection of notification preferences. Cost management includes features for performing cost analysis, setting per subscription budgets and alerts, setting recommendations for optimization, and exploring and exporting cost management data to perform deeper analysis. Access to cost management service is dictated by scopes. A user must have at least read access. Ways to export a template. Export from a resource group or resource. This option generates a new template from existing resources. The exported template is a snapshot of the current state of the resource group. You can export an entire resource group or specific resources within that group. Save from history. This option retrieves an exact copy of a template used for deployment. You specify the deployment from the deployment history. And here's Chapter 1 summary. Windows 10 can be added to Azure AD as a device to be managed, enabling bring your own device or corporate cloud-only deployments with Azure AD Join. Azure AD Join enables administrators to manage device identity independently of users. Downstream Windows clients can be managed through Azure AD using Azure AD Hybrid Join. Conditional access is a feature of Azure AD which allows administrators to control access to cloud applications through additional checks such as user location, the device the user is accessing the cloud app from, and more. Multiple Azure AD tenants can be created and managed through Azure. This includes creating new directories and deleting existing directories. Users and groups can be created through Azure Portal, PowerShell, Azure Client, Azure CLI, and the Graph API. Users and groups can be managed in bulk with tools like PowerShell. Self-service password resets can be combined with the password write-back features of Azure AD Connect to allow users to reset their passwords from the cloud while adhering to on-premises password standards. Tags in Azure can be viewed to logically organize resources by categories. Each tag is a name and a value pair. Tags can be shared across multiple resources and enforced with Azure Policy. Azure Policy is a service that lets you create, manage, and apply policy to Azure resources at a subscription, resource group, or resource level. Policies enforce different rules over your Azure resources so that resources remain compliant with your organization's standards. Role-based access control allows you to grant users, groups, and service principals access to Azure resources at the subscription, resource group, or resources with RBAC inheritance. The three core roles are owner, contributor, and reader. Declaratively describe a set of resources. These resources can be then added to a new or existing resource group. Templates can simplify orchestration because you only need to deploy the template to deploy all your resources. Template allows you to configure multiple resources simultaneously and use variables, parameters, functions to create dependencies between resources. Azure Policy can be used to enforce tagging rules and conventions by automatically applying or requiring tags to resources. Tags are used to add supplemental information to resources such as environment purpose. Management groups can contain multiple subscriptions and support role assignments. Tags at the resource level would be automatically included in the billing report available in the Azure portal, which includes per resource cost. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Chapter 1. Wasn't that fun? Tune into the next one where we go over Chapter 2.